God grant that she lie still. Written by Cynthia Asquith. Edward E. French speaking. Her tormented body rolled over to one side, leaving the inscription on the gray lichened stone exposed. As I knelt, I involuntarily read the brief words, "Here lies the body of Elspeth Clewer. God grant that she lie still." I recalled my first visit to the churchyard. So it was upon the grave of Elspeth Clewer, the uncommended ancestress who had so aroused my curiosity, that Margaret lay. "No, no, no," was wrung from her lips as she writhed as though in anguish. I raised her gently. Strength was required. It was like lifting a body from quicksand. Fearful of waking her, I slowly led her home and to her room. Sheen, the golden retriever, greeted me sleepily, but with his usual exquisite courtesy, and when I had laid her on the bed, he gently licked his mistress's white hand. I watched by her side for some time until her sleep seemed tranquil and normal. Then, in misplaced confidence, I left her alone, except for the dog, who lay stretched out his golden length across the bed. Anxious to see her the next morning, I went round as early as possible, intending to explain my uninvited visit by a wish to alter a prescription. But Rebecca met me in the passage, her honest brow besieged with worry. "You're a glad sight for sore eyes, Doctor. I was just going to send for you. Miss Margaret's just like she was yesterday, deep drowned in that sleep that don't seem natural. I can't abide to see her like that." "I think it only means that she's very overtired," I said, anxious to soothe. "That's as may be," she answered, unconvinced, "though what she's done to get so tired I don't know. And, Doctor, there's something most dreadful's gone and happened. I suppose that dratted cat must have got into my lady's room in the night and forced its way, the cunning brute, into the bird-cage. And there's them two sweet little birds, as Miss Margaret set such store by, lying dead in their blood with their poor little heads torn right off their bodies. Really, I don't know how to tell Miss Margaret when she wakes. She'll take on so." "I'll tell her," I said as I followed her into the bedroom, hastily adding, "but for heaven's sake, take away the cage. She mustn't see that awful sight when she wakes." With little moans of concern, the maid hurried away with her gruesome burden. Margaret lay in deep unconsciousness. Her appearance was in every way the same as on the previous morning. I turned over her limp hand to feel her pulse. Then I heard my heart hammering in my ears. It was as though it had attended and taken in something my mind refused to accept. Soon I felt deadly sick. Self-protection, reason, fought against the evidence of my sight, but in vain. The lovely white hand that I had so often ached to kiss was thickly smeared with red, and sticking between the fingers and thumb was a cluster of blood-stained feathers. For the first time I knew what it was to shudder with my whole being. Difficult though it was to control my thoughts, prompt action was necessary, and, fetching warm water, I hastily washed all traces from her hand. Soon afterwards she turned, and, struggling through layers of oblivion and subconsciousness, came to herself. Bewilderment showed in her eyes. "What's the matter?" she said, looking at my face. Struggling to hide the shrinking that I felt, I explained my presence and wrote out a prescription. Margaret looked round the room for her inseparable companion. "Where's Sheen?" she asked. "He wasn't in here when I come in this morning, miss," said Rebecca, "and I can't find him nowhere. I've asked everyone, and no one's seen him." "He must have jumped out the window," said Margaret. "How queer of him." At her request I looked out of the window. The flower bed below plainly showed a dog's paw marks. "I must get up and go and hunt for him," said Margaret. "I had a horrid dream about him." She looked deathly pale, quite unfit to leave her bed, but I knew it would be useless to attempt to detain her. I had come to the conclusion that I must tell her of her sleepwalking and insist that she should have a night nurse for a time. I wanted an opportunity to break this to her as unalarmingly as possible, so I reminded her of her promise to call on a farmer's wife and try to persuade the obstinate woman to obey my injunctions and send her crippled child to a hospital. She agreed to come that afternoon. As I left the house, I remembered that I had not told her about the death of the birds. Neither had she noticed the absence of their cage. At 3 o'clock we started on our 2-mile walk across the fields. It was a lovely afternoon, resplendent summer, though a delicious tang in the air hinted at autumn and brought an exquisite pink to Margaret's cheeks. More than ever I was struck by her astonishing look of dewy youth. Like a just-opened rose, her face looked utterly unused, as though it had never harbored any expression save one of vague expectancy. "Have you heard of the cat's crime?" she asked. Her eyes looked like wet flowers, and her voice quivered, though characteristically she tried to laugh as she added, "Of all Shakespeare's adjectives, I think the queerest are his harmless and necessary applied to a cat." "I adored those little birds." I murmured sympathy. "I'm wretchedly worried about Sheen's disappearance, too," she said. "He's never been away from me for even an hour before. He'll go mad with misery without me. Do you think he can have been stolen?" "I'm quite sure he hasn't," I said emphatically. I steered the conversation until, as unconcernedly as possible, I told her I had discovered that she was given to the quite common but not to be encouraged habit of sleepwalking. Consternation flared in her eyes, and she flushed painfully. She tried to laugh it off. "I wonder what my particular damned spot may be. It always is some damned spot that won't out that makes people walk in their sleep, isn't it? Or may it be merely due to unsubmissive food? It's far more often caused by indigestion than by conscience," I said with a laugh, and I took advantage of this wave of flippancy to float the hospital nurse into the conversation. To my surprise and relief, Margaret promptly acquiesced. In fact, it seemed to me that a look of unmistakable relief flickered across her face. I told her an excellent nurse was just about to leave one of my patients, and that I would engage her to come in that evening. "You won't need to see her at all during the day," I said. "She'll just sit up in your room at night." "Oh, I hope she doesn't knit," laughed Margaret. "I don't expect sleep will ever slide into my soul with her sitting there. I shall be the watched pot that never boils. However, no sleep, no walking, so it will be all to the good." With that, we dismissed the matter. "Now let's forget everything except this winged hour. It is such a heavenly afternoon," she exclaimed. "Thank heaven I can always live in the present. I hope you don't think it's dreadful to have a nature like a duck's back." She stepped out, and the shadow which had overhung her ever since that unexpected outburst in her sitting room lifted from her. Once more she shone out as the radiant being I had first known. It was impossible not to be infused by her brilliant gaiety, and as her lovely peals of laughter rang out, for the time being my nightmare was almost dispersed. Her inimitable mimicry, delicious raillery, and stream of brilliantly garbled quotations almost made me forget the unforgettable. But her radiance suddenly clouded over when I said, "What an amazing memory you have got." "Memory?" she answered almost sharply. "Yes, I admit I have plenty of memory and understanding. But what protection are such merely receptive qualities?" "Protection?" I echoed blankly. "Well, here we are," she said in evasion, her hand on the farmyard gate. "Now I propose that you stay here while I go in by myself and twist the good woman round my little finger. I'm sure your presence would cramp my little finger's style. I'll wish it luck." And pulling off her glove, she smilingly held up her tapering, pink-nailed finger. "What's the matter?" she asked uneasily. I'm afraid an uncontrollable inward shudder must have shown on my face. The last time I had looked at that slender finger, it had been stained with blood, and I could still see the pitiful little feathers that had stuck to it. "I've got a stitch," I lied. "I'll wait here for your good news. Good luck." A prey to uninvited thoughts, I leaned against the gate. About 5 minutes later I heard myself hailed and was delighted to see the gardener with Sheen on a chain. As I patted the beautiful dog's head, he slowly waved his sweeping tail. "Please, sir," explained the gardener, "the keeper found him in a distant wood, and when he brings him home, Miss Park, knowing where you was going, she asks me to follow you, thinking Miss Clewer would be that pleased to see him safe." Delighted to be the bearer of good news, I hurried towards the farmhouse and was met by Margaret. triumph to my little finger," she began. But directly I spoke of Sheen, her successful mission was forgotten in delight, and she ran towards the gate. "Darling, darling Sheen, how could you leave me?" I heard her eager voice. Then something so dreadful happened, something so painful, that even now I can scarcely endure to recall it. As Margaret approached her dog, expecting an exuberant welcome, an unaccountable change came over him. His tail was lowered until it disappeared between his cringing legs, and his whole body shook with unmistakable terror. "Sheen! What's the matter?" Her voice was piteous, and, looking at her face, I saw it contorted with unbearable suffering. "It's me," she pleaded. "Sheen, it's me." But the dog, she had said, would be mad with misery without her, cowered lower and lower as though it would creep through the ground, and his golden coat grew dark with sweat. "Oh, what did happen last night?" wailed Margaret, and put out her hands to the dog in anguished propitiation. "Back, miss, back!" shouted the terrified gardener. The dog's eyes showed white. He howled, snapped wildly in Margaret's direction, and tore at his collar in frantic efforts to escape. "Take him away!" cried Margaret. "Take him away! I'll go back by the road." And she started off as fast as her swift stride would carry her. I overtook her, but could think of nothing to say. A terrible constraint lay between us. I looked at her. Tears coursed down her white, strained face, and her mortally affronted eyes stared straight in front. "Unaccountable things. Dogs?" At last I ventured. "Unaccountable? Do you think so?" she said sharply. "I wonder." And as she strode on, she clenched her hands till the knuckles stood out white. A moment later she turned to me as though she were on the point of really speaking, of letting something gush out. She made a little movement with one hand, but then it was as though an iron shutter slid between us, and in a cold, formal voice she told me of her successful interview with the farmer's wife. That was all we spoke of. We might almost have been strangers. The next morning I went to give her some electric treatment. She looked bitterly troubled, but said she liked the hospital nurse, a pleasant, serene-faced young woman. I missed the accustomed twitter of the birds, and the room looked strangely deserted without the beautiful golden dog. I dared not ask about him, and I never saw him again. With a pang of pity, I noticed that all the mirrors had been removed. "Has that queer thing happened again?" I ventured. "Did you think there was something wrong with your reflection?" "Don't ask me about that any more," she answered feverishly. "I've finished with all that fanciful nonsense, and I never wish to hear it alluded to again. Never, never, never." With that, a safety curtain of unhappy reserve fell between us. She seemed to consign herself to the loneliness of utter withdrawal, and from that time onward the shadows settled more and more darkly on her beautiful face. A few days after her arrival, I asked the nurse to come and talk to me about her patient. She had nothing very definite to report, except that though her charge slept for a fair number of hours, her sleep was very troubled and brought little refreshment. In fact, she always seemed most tired and overwrought in the mornings. "Of course," the nurse said, "I do think that having no fresh air in the room, these stifling hot nights, may have something to do with her condition." "Why," I asked, "do you mean to say she doesn't have the window open in this weather?" The stubborn summer had blazed out into a last fierce spell of heat, and I was indeed amazed. "No, sir. I can't persuade her to, and sometimes I can scarcely bear the closeness myself." I promised to use my influence. "Then there's another thing," the nurse went on. "Do you think it can be good for anyone in an excited state of nerves to be doing all that rehearsing? If you'll excuse my saying so, sir, I think you should order her to give up those theatricals." "Theatricals?" I echoed blankly. What theatricals?" "I don't know when they're to be, but I know she's very busy rehearsing for them. Whenever she sends me to fetch something during the night, and she's always asking me to fetch some book or something special from the still room, not that she ever scorns to use the things when I bring them. Well, as I come back, all the way down that long passage, I hear her fairly screaming out her part. Wonderful actress she must be." You wouldn't really think it could be her own voice. No, you wouldn't think such a sweet young lady could produce so horrid a voice. It simply raises my hair. That acting voice of hers does. And as I was saying, I really can't think it can be good for anyone whose nerves are disturbed to be studying so violent a part. Thank you, nurse. I'll speak about it. That afternoon I called on Margaret. After some casual talk, I said, I hear you sleep with your window shut. And you know you're looking extremely pale. To insist on keeping the window open all the year round may be a foolish fetish, but in this sort of weather, it really is essential. If the nurse makes a fuss about that, I won't keep her, Margaret burst out. How can I leave the window open when it's from there that I feel that awful pressing in, that pressing and pushing away? How can I? Though heaven knows it's foolish enough to think it's of any use to shut things. If stone walls cannot a prison make, nor iron bars a cage, still less can they make a fortress. Suddenly she seemed to remember herself. But these are but wild and whirring words, she said, smiling. I'm so sorry. Please don't pay any attention to them. My disease of quoting grows worse and worse. It's because I have no opinions of my own. She looked disquietingly excited, and my own head swam. That awful pressing in. What could she mean? A sense of dreadful menace almost stifled me, and I felt utterly estranged, but something had to be said. When are your theatricals to be? I asked. I didn't know you were acting. Acting? She repeated. What do you mean? The nurse tells me she often hears you rehearsing at night. She blushed crimson. Oh, that, she said. Oh, yes. You see, I have a silly habit of reciting poetry aloud to myself, and it made me feel self-conscious to know she had overheard me, so I said I was rehearsing for some theatricals. I see, I said, but my heart sank at hearing her lie. Then we spoke of other things, but we were both hopelessly preoccupied, and there was no life in our talk. It was almost forced, and I noted that nearly everything that Margaret said was in inverted commas. Scarcely anything passed her lips that was not a quotation. I had already observed that the more tired, strained, or preoccupied she seemed, the more this was the case. When her vitality was lowered, it was, to use her own words, as though she had no opinion, emotion, or impulse of her own, but was merely a thoroughfare for the thoughts of others, as though nothing remained to hold the fort except memory. It was, I think, 3 days later that the nurse, of her own accord, came to report to me again, and told me she considered her patient increasingly nervous and depressed. To my enquiry as to how Miss Clure was sleeping, she answered, "Very little now," adding ominously, "And if you ask me, sir, I don't think she wants to go to sleep." She's given up the theatricals anyhow, hasn't she? I asked, in as casual a voice as I could command. Given them up, sir? No, I wish to goodness sake she would. I really can scarcely bear to hear it. The way she screams out her part has thoroughly got on my nerves. As often as I come back along that passage, she's going through it. I know some of her part by heart myself. I don't believe I'll ever be able to forget the queer words. What are the words you overhear her saying? I asked, as indifferently as I could. Saying? You wouldn't call it saying if you'd heard her, sir. It's more like yelling. As I was saying the other day, you'd never think such a gentle lady could produce such a terrifying voice. The words that she most often repeats are, "Let me in, give way. What can I do without a body? What use are you making of your body? I want it. You clear out. I must be lodged. I must be lodged. I must be lodged." And the third time she repeats, "I must be lodged," her voice rises to a screech. But whatever's the matter, sir? You've come over as white as a sheet. Murmuring that I felt faint and must get some brandy, I told her I would see her in the evening and left the room. My legs almost gave way as I went upstairs, and directly I reached my bedroom I turned the key in the lock, though what it was I thought might thus be debarred, God only knows. With shaking hands, I opened the book I had been reading in bed the night before. It was a bound copybook filled with the faded brown of a spidery 16th century writing. Margaret had long given me the freedom of her library, and on a high shelf I had found a manuscript book, a sort of irregular journal kept by an ancestress of hers, also a Margaret Cluer. I had read it far into the night. It was all interesting, and by the final heartbroken entry I had been most vividly and painfully impressed. Were certain words really as, with horror, I remembered them, or was my memory deceiving my disturbed nerves? Trembling, I turned the leaves until I came to the words. So she is dead. Elspeth. Our shame lies dead, that I should live to thank God that my own child be laid in the churchyard. A sennight yesterday, since they carried her home after her fall from her horse. A sennight of torment unimagined to us all. The passing of her evil spirit has been a horror past belief. The drawing nigh of death had no softening effect on her violent, evil, greedy spirit. Her hold on life was terrible. Breath by breath it was torn from her shattered body. So her fierce spirit clung to her beautiful, broken body. God help us all! Could any death be deep enough to make me to forget how with her last breath she cried out, I won't die. I won't die. There is still so much to do. Some way I'll get back. I must get back. My spirit is so unquenched. I must find another body. I must be lodged. I must be lodged. I must be lodged. The long-dead woman's manuscript slipped from my hand, and I struggled to think. Even last night the words of the dying changeling daughter had made me shiver. Now, after what the nurse had quoted, they seared my mind. Elspeth Cluer. I remembered the gray, uncommunicative grave beneath the yew tree. Its bleak reticence had impressed my imagination on my first visit to the churchyard, and now, to my mind's eye, it was forever associated with Margaret's prostrate, writhing body. God grant that she lie still. God grant that she lies still. I snatched at a faint, fluttering hope. Perhaps Margaret was familiar with the journal I had found. If so, its grim contents would be very likely to haunt her. Might not what the nurse mistook for rehearsing have been her quoting it in her disturbed sleep? That evening I found her pale and wild-eyed. I told her of my discovery of the diary and asked her if she had ever read it. She disclaimed all knowledge, and this time I knew she spoke the truth. I said it gave a strange account of an ancestress of hers, an Elspeth Cluer. Was it my fancy, or did she draw in her breath at the same time? Oh. Does it? She said. Yes, I've heard of her. Though she died before she was 23, she's the only celebrated member of the Cluer family, for she crowded her short with every imaginable vice and crime. I believe she was an absolute mythical monster of violence and cruelty. But as I have often told you, I really don't take the faintest interest in my ancestors. 2 days later, as I sat at breakfast, the front doorbell was so violently pulled that I went to the door myself. The faithful Rebecca stood there, her face mottled with agitation. "Oh, sir, she's been and gone and bolted." "Miss Cluer?" I gasped. "No, sir," she gabbled breathlessly. "That your nurse been and gone and off'n it. Left my poor lamb with no word to no one. Yes, when I comes along this morning, I finds my lady deep asleep, and, if you please, on the floor there's a tray with broken pieces of cup and saucer and Binger's food slopped all over the carpet. Just dropped out of the nurse's hand, it must have been. And she couldn't be found nowhere. Clean gone she was, run off and left all her things behind her. The garden boy, he tells me he's seen her tearing round the garden like as though the devil were after her. I looks in at the station, and they said she'd been there a full hour before the first train went, and looked that queer without no hat nor nothing. And my lady, she looks to go to your heart this morning. She says she calls to mind asking nurse to fetch her a cup of Binger's. And then she thinks she must have fallen asleep, since she doesn't remember no more." Incensed with the nurse, I rang up the London association from which she came and instructed them to telephone directly she arrived. Full of foreboding, I hurried to the manor house. I found Margaret walking up and down in the garden, her face drawn and set. "I'm sorry I've frightened your nurse away," she said bitterly. "Frightened her? You?" I tried to laugh. "So it seems. A well-trained nurse who drops her tray and flies from the house must surely be a little upset." "She must have taken leave of her senses," I said dryly. "Fortunately, I know of an admirable one who happens to be free now." "No, thank you. No more nurses for me. I can't say I've found the last one very reassuring. No, I've just telegraphed to lots of my friends to come down. I've been too unsociable lately." She spoke defiantly, and I knew it would be no use to argue. That afternoon I was rung up by the matron of the nursing association. Nurse Newson had never turned up, but on inquiry it was found that she had gone to her mother, whose telephone number I was given. "Mrs. Newson speaking," answered a painstakingly genteel voice. I explained who I was, stating that I wished to speak to her daughter, whose amazing behavior demanded explanation. The voice let itself go, and unmistakable relish in a crisis was plain through its agitation. "Oh, sir, I'm afraid you can't speak to my daughter. She's in bed, and doctor says she's suffering from shock and mustn't be disturbed." "Oh, sir, whatever did happen to make her take on so? Such a sensible, steady girl as she is. She's in ever such a state. I never did see anyone so upset before, and I can't get from her what it is she's so scared on. At least nothing that you would call coherent. And please, sir, she says she's terribly sorry to have to let you down, but she couldn't have stayed on. Not for any consideration." Feeling no sympathy, I snapped out, "I never heard of such behavior. A nurse abandoning a case in the middle of the night? She must be hopelessly hysterical. What possible excuse can she have? Her patient is the most charming young lady." "Yes, she says the young lady she was engaged for was ever so sweet. But, doctor, I don't understand. She talks so wild, and when I question her, begs me not to ask. But wasn't there another young lady?" Exasperated, I banged the receiver down. It was necessary to go to the manor house to give the address to which the nurse's luggage was to be sent. I would have gone in, but 2 cars were just unloading their freight of visitors. Loud voices echoed in the courtyard, and aggressively young people brandishing tennis rackets bounded up the steps towards their hostess, who stood in the doorway, her face resolutely gay, with a forlorn sense of being cut off from her, and with apprehension heavy on my heart, I stole away. As I looked back at the house, gilded by the setting sun, I almost hated it for its unconcerned beauty. 2 days later I received a note in her strangely variable, but always recognizable writing. It had no beginning. "Neither can I live here by myself. I don't understand, but believe me, it's fearful, and I must go. Oh, God! There are more things in heaven and earth. I'll write. Margaret Cluer." She went abroad, and I was glad to know her gone. If life became unutterably dreary, at least my nightmare fears were in abeyance. Naturally, I wrote begging for an explanation of her note, but none came. I had many letters from her, but except for the one line, "I am so glad I came away," they told me nothing. They were merely brilliant descriptions of her travels, little more than inspired Baedekers, with scarcely a word to show we had ever been great friends and shared an unacknowledged dread. I wrote to Rebecca to inquire after her mistress's health. Her reply said her young lady seemed well enough, but appeared restless and as though not really enjoying the full life she led. As the leaves fluttered down till winter lay like iron over the land, the magical days of that long summer began to assume the golden haze of something dreamed. Often I would go and gaze at her empty home. I began to wonder whether I was ever to see her again. There was even a rumor that the manor house was to be let on a long lease. One morning, when an unusually reluctant spring had at last turned the fields to glory, I was surprised to see on an envelope bearing a London postmark the writing that always made my heart leap. I read, "I find it quite impossible to stay away any longer. I feel myself irresistibly drawn home, but I shall not sleep in my old room. I shall come back Monday, but shall arrive late. Please come to luncheon Tuesday. Margaret Clure. Coming home Monday. This was Monday. I should see her in little more than 24 hours. The day crept by with unbelievable slowness. To hasten tomorrow, I went to bed unusually early. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly, and with the certainty that I had been aroused by some sound. Yes, there it was again. Outside the house. Small pebbles were being thrown up against my window. Expecting an emergency call, I struggled out of sleeplessness and looked out of my low window. The moon was full. A tall figure stood below. A white, upturned face gleamed in the silvery green light. It was Margaret! Her loveliness glimmered in the strange cold light, but she looked wild, and there was a desperate urgency in her voice. "Quick! Quick!" she cried. "I must have your help. I'm so frightened. Quick! Let me in! Let me in! This time I'll tell you everything." Snatching my overcoat, I hurried downstairs as quietly as I could for fear of waking my servant, and opened the door. It was no dream. The white figure stood outside, arms outstretched towards me. A glorious hope leaped in my heart, but as I advanced, something indescribable looked out of her eyes. With desperate haste her hands moved, and in a second her face was entirely concealed by the chiffon scarf in which they had swathed it. "Too late! Too late!" she wailed in a changing voice. "Go back! Go back! And for God's sake, don't dare to follow me!" The white figure sped away. Aghast, I started in pursuit, but after a few strides, the swathed, faceless figure turned. At the torrent of words that was shrieked at me in an unknown voice, I stood transfixed, frozen with horror. Wild, nauseating fear took possession of me. God forgive me, I renounced her. To save my soul, I could not have followed another step. I stole back and, drenched in cold sweat, lay shaking on my bed. Sleep never approached me, but I felt too shattered and ill to get up at my usual hour. At 10, the telephone rang. Wondering what ghastly intimation was to come, I lifted the receiver. Margaret's lovely voice slid into my astonished ears. "It's me. Please come and see me. They tell me I'm not well." Her own lovely voice that I had not hoped to hear again. Had some monstrous dream imposed itself upon me? Almost I began to think it. When I reached the manor house, I asked where Miss Clure's new room was. "Just the same as before, sir," replied the parlour-maid. "Miss Clure did give orders for one to be prepared on the other side of the house, but as soon as she came, she said she'd go back to her own room." Rebecca lay in wait in the familiar passage. "Thank God you've come, Doctor," she whispered. "She seems to be wandering in her mind this morning." I stole into the room. Margaret, strangely beautiful, but wan and fragile, lay back on a great pillow. She stretched out both hands in welcome. At once I knew that her memory held no trace of last night. She greeted me as though we met for the first time since her departure all those long months ago. "Rebecca thinks I'm ill," she said, "but I must be a creature incapable of my own distress, because I assure you I feel quite well, and, oh, so glad to see my physician." Did I say that after the incident of the dog I was only once again to see Margaret in her incomparable radiance? Strange that it should have been now, when I was prepared to find her in delirium. But thus it was. Once more she seemed her original, untroubled, sparkling self. She questioned me about all the Mossstone news and gave irresistibly funny descriptions of people she had met on her travels. All was as I first remembered her: dancing voice, lovely laughter, buoyant, bubbling talk, lightning response, showers of quotations. What had Rebecca meant by describing her as delirious? But suddenly a change came into her eyes. She clutched at my hands and held them tight. Then she began to, what Rebecca described as, wander. Her voice was solemn. "As the tree falls, so shall it lie. That is true, isn't it, John?" John? I had almost forgotten my unused Christian name. "It is true in every sort of way," she went on. "Isn't it, darling? And as that tree lies, So shall it be all through the days of eternity. That's true, too, isn't it, John? Absolutely true? Yes. Yes, of course, I soothed her. Oh, John, she went on, I've just found such a lovely, lovely poem. I didn't know it before. I can't think how I could have missed it. It's by Barnfield. Just listen to the mournful magic of these 2 lines. King Pandion, he is dead. All thy friends are lapped in lead. Lapped in lead. Doesn't that make death sound delicious and luxurious? As though to be alive were something very makeshift. She gave a little quick laugh. Lapped in lead, she repeated very slowly. Oh, how lovely and peaceful and untormented. You know, that would be the best thing that could happen to me, don't you? The best thing that could happen to your me. Then your me would be safe. An urgent summons came, and I had to go to a distant case, telling Rebecca on no account to leave her for a moment, and that I would get a nurse to come as soon as possible. I hurried away. It was for a birth that I had been summoned. The baby was as reluctant to enter the world as its mother seemed disposed to leave it, and midnight had already struck when I reached home. Through all the strain of that endless day, I had been haunted by Margaret, and I intended to snatch some supper and hurry back to the manor house. But before I had sat down, the telephone rang. It was Rebecca's voice. Come quick, come at once. Miss Margaret seems so weak, as though she couldn't scarcely breathe. I'm speaking from her room. The voice broke off. It was no longer at the mouthpiece, but I heard it cry out in deathly terror, Oh, God, who? And then the telephone must have been dropped. No further sound came through. I replaced the receiver, and after a moment's pause rang up the exchange, in my impatience violently rattling the instrument. Number, please, expostulated the exchange. I gave the number several times, but there was nothing to be heard beyond the intermittent ringing of an unanswered call. I pictured the overturned telephone lying on the floor of Margaret's room. What had happened? Leaping into my car, I drove to the manor house. The front door stood wide open, but no one was about. I did not meet anyone on my way to Margaret's room. The whole house was deserted. What I saw when I approached the bed no one could attempt to describe and keep their reason. It writhed and moaned and seemed to breathe with terrible difficulty. I averted my eyes from the face, and with the automatic professional instinct to preserve life, administered an injection. The thing on the bed gave a convulsive shudder, and I heard the fast, thick breathing of some desperate struggle. Determined not to see the usurper again, I kept my eyes shut. I dared not look. Then there was silence, followed by a gentle sigh. Something in that gentle sigh impelled me to open my eyes. Ineffable relief flowed over me, like pure silver rising through primeval slime. The being I loved had struggled through and triumphed over the awful spiritual hideousness of that invasion. It was Margaret's face that smiled at me. Her voice came sweet, but hopelessly weak. It's all right, darling, she breathed, and in her voice was a tenderness I had never imagined. It's all right. I've won. It's me. You're me. Don't let me give way again. Keep me safe. Sure of her haven, she gazed at me. Her hand clung to mine, and her lips smiled. But the strain of that final struggle had been too much for the already weakened heart. The eyelids fluttered up once or twice as her clasp of my hand loosened. Almost inaudibly, but with an ecstasy of glimpsed peace, she breathed out the words, lapped in lead. Lapped in lead. And something else I could not quite hear. I felt a last little clinging clutch at my hand, and with one or two long sighs, the spirit I loved slipped from its beautiful lodging. Some hours later, I left the deserted house and returned to the emptied world. Gratitude mingled with my grief. My broken heart was at peace. for I knew her to be unassailable. The long dread was at an end. It is a desolate path I tread, but sometimes when it seems most steep and bare, there comes, like a gentle wave washing against my brain, the soft assuagement of her voice, murmuring, "Lapped in lead, lapped in lead." And again I hear the promise in the infinite tenderness of her whispered, "Darling." What were the words I failed to hear? I often linger round her empty home. No smoke rises from the twisted chimneys, but pigeons still flutter and croon, and the grey house I once thought so aloof seems to receive me into an atmosphere of benign peace. God grant that she lies still. Written by Cynthia Asquith. Edward E. French speaking.
Copyright exists on all recordings issued by Edward E. French. Any unauthorized broadcasting, public performance, copying, or re-recording of these audiobooks in any manner whatsoever will constitute an infringement of such copyright. Editing, alteration, copying, or redistribution inconsistent with copyright laws is prohibited, whether by digital, electronic, or other means. Links may be used, provided that full and clear credit is given to Edward E. French with appropriate and specific direction to the original content. Direct inquiries regarding this recording to Edward E. French at email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. Subscribe to the Fiction Fantastique channel, www.youtube.com/FrenchEdward06.